Okay.
Well, this is the, sorry.
Sì?
The name of the panel is, sorry.
I don't know what it is. I don't have the name of my own panel.
I was on charge of the moderation because at the last minute.
Prossima pagina? Qua.
I
Here
have
we
no
go.
time to read. This is Reframing Italian Identity, Film Music and Diasporic Narratives in Media. This is the name of the session. And the first speaker is Samuel Sylvester. And we changed the dynamic because everyone presents himself.
Or herself, yeah?
Or herself.
Hello everybody, my name is Samuel Sylvester. I'm a first-year PhD student in Italian Studies at the University of Texas at Austin in Italian Studies. I'm interested in visual culture, contemporary literature, translation studies, particularly between Italy, Poland, and the United States. So I'll just jump right into it. My presentation is titled Guidos of Affluent Suburbia, White Italian-American Adolescence in the Virgin Suicides.
Manu, puoi alzare un po' l'audio perché ci dicono dall'audience che non sente, dal pubblico non sente.
Better?
Grazie.
Okay. Sofia Coppola's 1999 film, The Virgin Suicides, is a film that in the 25 years following its release has achieved cult status among American millennials, zillennials, and Gen Zers, and particularly amongst the gays and the girls. It's a film that has a unique ability to speak to these young people with its nuanced and evocative images of the monotony of contemporary suburban life in the United States and the sensationalization of these images, their simultaneous relatability and glamour. It's an American cultural coming-of-age story, told in a manner that is gray, soulless, and transcendental, mirroring the only version of our country Americans my age have ever experienced. The characters in The Virgin Suicides, as well as many of the film's cult fans who feel connected to it, reap many of the benefits of the American dream of times past, though the dream at play here is more akin to a nightmare or a fever dream. What is of interest in my investigation into The Virgin Suicides, which is set in the final years of the 20th century, is the curious depiction of Italian-American youth. These characters are both rather dynamic and also informed by and in dialogue with a long history of mediatic representation of Italian-American youth in the mass media of the United States. They too are presented to the viewer by Sofia Coppola, an Italian-American herself, who of course has close personal and familial ties to the patrimony of this media history. The perspective with which she imbues her presentation of these Italian-American personages inaugurates a new era in this history. Okay. The point of departure for my investigations is the novel from which the film is adapted, also titled The Virgin Suicides. It was released in 1993 and was the first published book of its author, Jeffrey Eugenides, American novelist and professor of creative writing at New York University. Eugenides was born in Detroit and grew up in Grosse Pointe, an affluent suburb of the city. He is an author fascinated by American culture, its multiplicities, its complexities, and its distinctiveness. He is particularly interested in the culture of Detroit, the epicenter of the American automobile industry, the city bearing the nickname Motown, and the living, or rather dying, example par excellence of the decline of American manufacturing. In a 2017 interview with Michigan Radio, an NPR affiliate, Eugenides expresses that, quote, "The experience of growing up in the city has affected my writing because it acquainted me very early on with not only turmoil, but impermanence of human habitation, and then the passing away of all things. There's a certain melancholy in some of my early writing, which I think comes directly out of things which you relied on suddenly not being there anymore," end quote. His writing largely adheres to the stylistics of the contemporary Bildungsroman, and syntactically it's rich, careful, and rather lyrical. In terms of thematics, his work often meditates on suburban life and the cultural tendencies associated with it, on love, and on American social life more generally. So, 6 years after the release of his first novel, Sofia Coppola adapts it for the silver screen. In a 2018 interview with The Guardian, Coppola remarks, quote, "When I was in my mid-20s, I came across The Virgin Suicides. I remember seeing the cover. It was just all this blonde hair. I read it and I loved it. It felt like Jeffrey Eugenides, the writer, really understood the experience of being a teenager. The longing, the melancholy, the mystery between boys and girls. I loved how the boys were so confused by the girls, and I really connected with all that lazing around in your bedroom. I didn't feel like I saw that very much in films, not in a way I could relate to, end quote. This novel Coppola read and loved became her first feature film. Of course, getting her foot in the door to filmmaking wasn't a particularly unreasonable prerogative. She's part of the legendary filmmaking dynasty, the Coppolas. Her father, Francis Ford Coppola, directed the Godfather trilogy, which, of course, also makes him a practitioner of cinematic adaptation, as it was Mario Puzo's eponymous novel, which he transformed into film. The Coppola dynasty also counts Sofia's brother, director Roman Coppola, and her cousin, the actor Nicolas Cage, as its members. In this same Guardian interview, Coppola discusses the process by which she came into directing and the role her father had on her directing. She says, quote, "I grew up with a lot of men. It was me and 9 boys, once you count all my brothers and cousins. My dad was a macho filmmaker, and his friends were all of that ilk, so I think I really clung to femininity and a kind of girly aesthetic," end quote. It's pertinent to consider the role her upbringing played in the development of her cinematographic voice. In her 9 films between 1999 and today, The Virgin Suicides, Lost in Translation, Marie Antoinette, Somewhere, The Bling Ring, The Beguiled, On the Rocks, Fairyland, and Priscilla, all more or less are concerned with the unremarkableness or banality of the culture of fame, with personal or social isolation, or with family relations. Coppola's rehashing of Eugenides' The Virgin Suicides, which is an eclectic fusion of all these themes, manages to breathe an additional level of life into the characters Eugenides writes. But this is especially true for the work's characters of Italian-American ethnicity, taking into account our director's Italian-American identity and membership in a family which has been in the business of depicting Italian-Americans for decades. The narrative follows the life and death of a group of 5 sisters, the Lisbons, in an affluent suburb of Detroit, based somewhat faithfully on the suburb where Eugenides himself grew up. One by one, the Lisbon sisters commit suicide, and the reason for each of their deaths is never explicitly articulated, only speculated by members in the larger community. The girls are equally as beautiful and as affluent as the neighborhood they live in, but spiritually they are empty, as illustrated by their suicides. Their self-inflicted deaths can be read as a signifier of the shared spiritual emptiness of their suburb, and neighborhoods like it across the United States at the turn of the 21st century, in the inaugural period of American decline, in post-exceptionalist America. This story of the Lisbon sisters and their suicides is narrated by a group of neighborhood boys. Their retelling is not contemporaneous to the actual arc of events, but instead is told years later, after the fact, and they're looking to put together the pieces of why this transpired, why all 5 sisters took their lives. Themes of infatuation, of loss, memory, and a reflectivity on adolescence permeate the narration. The act of suicide is framed as something alluring, charming, and fascinating in the 2 texts, both literary and cinematic. The boys telling this story seem to understand all the other boys around, but the foreignness of the girls is perpetual and insurmountable. The normalcy of the girls becomes extraordinary as told by the boys. Marvel sprouts from monotony in this almost ethnographic tale of American life and youth culture. We may look to articulations of the notions of white flight to help us make sense of the neighborhood they occupy, of how this American moment came to be. As Crowder and South define it, white flight is, quote, the aversion to living in racially integrated settings, leading whites to vacate neighborhoods with large or growing minority populations, with such an exodus bolstering residential segregation by race. Indeed, despite generally more liberal attitudes over time, a sizable portion of white participants in the Detroit area study and the multi-city study of urban inequality conducted in the 1990s expressed a reluctance to remain in a moderately integrated neighborhood, end quote. White flight has played a key role in the history of Detroit. The development of affluent suburbs like Grosse Pointe and the one we see in the Virgin Suicides are a byproduct of the initiative of white American urbanites of both conservative and liberal orientation to flee the urban core of cities as legal segregation ends and an era of a more subdued, under-the-table, de facto segregation is ushered in. Suburbs of affluence are born of the avoidance of multicultural life and become the embodiment of monotony, sites of racial monotony which consciously or subconsciously proliferate American racial hierarchy. The racial turmoil of Detroit in the 1960s gives way to the metropolis's rapport with white flight and recalls the racial turmoil we see depicted in Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. Whereas the Italian Americans in Do the Right Thing, that is, the white people, live in Brooklyn, the neighborhood in the Virgin Suicides is ostensibly entirely white, as throughout the course of Coppola's film, there are no black characters depicted. The only instance of any form of multi-ethnicism in the film is through the presence of Italian Americans, and this is only on the ethnic plane, never the racial plane. The only drop of multiculturalism permissible in a white flight neighborhood like this is the olive skin and olive culture of the Italian. In coming into an understanding of the Italian-American characters of Eugenides and Coppola, it is helpful to trace the history of their representation. Oftentimes, Italian-Americans have been put in the position par excellence of foreignness or alterity, specifically in the context of the Protestant and Anglophone American mainstream. They are similar enough to still be white, but just different enough through certain cultural markers to be othered. This perceived foreignness, this fundamental gap between real Americans and the Americans who arrived there from Italy, through the lens of American mass media, stems from something in the nature of the Italian émigré. That something is a criminality, a propensity towards deceitfulness, a tendency of this ethnic group to grasp onto the ways of the old world, which renders them only partial Americans, unenlightened to the ways of real American life. This is the thought process which dominates, historically speaking, how the American mass media has portrayed the Italian American. Cavallero and Plaskett describe the Italian American characters in the films Little Caesar, The Public Enemy, and the 1932 version of Scarface as such, quote, "They work hard and outmaneuver their competition, but they revert to the most sinful of means to achieve the most revolting of ends," end quote. The Italian American is Machiavelli's bastard. Italian American masculinity, represented as such, is a more violent masculinity when juxtaposed with mainline American masculinity. This trope sprouts and is reproduced over and over again in the chronology of American media, and it becomes a demarcating feature for the recognition of Italian male figures. So to dive into the Italian-American young men we meet in Coppola's film and Eugenides' novel, one of the first neighborhood boys the reader-spectator meets in the narrative embodies this trope, albeit in a more contemporary iteration, one wherein he is a fellow affluent suburbanite, and not as one of the urban minorities to flee from. This boy is named Paul Baldino. Paul serves a fundamental function in the propulsion of the plotline. Before Paul's introduction, all the other boys we encounter are presented without the articulation of their ethnic background. The characterization of Paul Baldino, on the other hand, is one which clearly emphasizes or exaggerates his Italian-American identity, situating him in line with the mediatic heredity of delinquency. He's not necessarily a delinquent in a legal context, per se, in this film from the turn of the 21st century, but his actions are nonetheless to be read as errant in comparison to those of his peers. On the level of aesthetics, Paul Baldino recalls the mafioso. This sets the tone for an introduction of the reader-spectator to a particular type of character, one entrenched in criminality, even as just a boy, in The Virgin Suicides, which is a film particularly engaged with aesthetic values, with the visual culture of American life. The visual signifiers of Paul Baldino indicate his nature and correspond with the aesthetics of the American subculture analyzed by Sarah Troiani, the Guido, which we see in various media, including, of course, on Jersey Shore. Troiani articulates that, quote, "The representation of Italian-American identity on Jersey Shore operates as a form of cultural masquerade," end quote. In The Virgin Suicides, Paul Baldino operates as an iteration of cultural masquerading. The boys introduce us to him as such, quote, "Paul Baldino had the gangster cut and hitman face of his father, Sammy the Shark Baldino, and of all those men who enter and exited the big Baldino house with the two lions carved in stone beside the front steps. He moved with the sluggish swagger of urban predators who smelled of cologne and had manicured nails. The circular drive ringed with laurel trees imported from Italy. His brightly polished black shoes, which he wore even playing baseball, chewing a toothpick and playing with the gold ring on his finger," end quote. He's a bona fide Guido. He masquerades his cultural identity just like his father does, just like a Guido does. They usurp the lawfulness and orderliness of the WASP neighborhood, but not enough to warrant a second, whitest flight, as, after all, they are economic peers of all their neighbors, even if they take a different approach to the display of their wealth. The way Paul Baldino propels forward this narrative, which I touched on a moment ago, plays into this discourse in an interesting manner. This stretches beyond his aesthetic representation and into his behavior, which, too, has a certain extrajudicial air about it. As family is at the forefront of the Italian-American experience, this air about Paul is derivative from his father. Paul, like his father, is associated with under-the-table relations, with a shady splendor, without explanation of how the family came into this life of comfort. In the juvenile economies of the neighborhood boys, Paul Baldino's accumulation of information on the Lisbon girls is similarly under the table and shady, something akin to the criminal, even if he never finds himself in hot water with the law. But this too is significant. The fact that he isn't persecuted by police or by the law, as it signals the fact that he, as an Italian-American, has crossed a certain threshold. Even though Italian-American men still embody this criminal air, it has shifted in character away from actual criminality and toward its perception by his mainline American peers as a source of entertainment. This is how we're introduced to Paul's illicit activity, which corresponds temporally with a Lisbon sister suicide. Quote, he had also snuck into other forbidden places in the past. He had crawled into the sewer duct underneath his own basement and had started walking, a few feet at a time. He had chose tunnels at random. As he passed under people's houses, he could smell what they were cooking. Finally, he had come up through the sewer grate in the Lisbon's basement, and he had stepped into the bathroom and found Cecilia, naked, her wrists oozing blood, and how after overcoming his shock, he had run downstairs to call the police first thing, because that was what his father had always taught him to do. End quote. Paul Baldino, situated in Italian-American history, represents an era in which, while he still possesses criminalistic characteristics stereotypical of the group, he's truly one of the neighborhood boys, not an outsider. He helps in the pursuit of their objectives, of cultivating knowledge about the Lisbon sisters, and he recognizes the importance of calling the police when this pursuit goes awry. He feels comfortable calling the police because he perceives that they will protect him. He doesn't fear that he will end up in jail, falsely accused of committing violence against this WASP girl like he might have if the story transpired a century before. Bondanella introduces us to a second trope of the Italian-American man. He tells us, quote, if there's any stereotypical image of Italians that has a longer history than the gangster, it is the Latin lover, end quote, to the likes of 1920 sex symbol and silent film actor Rudolph Valentino. By zooming out from views of the Italian-American as Guido and as gangster, and broadening our discussion to include the Italian-American as Latin lover, we widen our gaze of what this ethnic man can be seen as in the framework of American media. If he isn't mafioso, a man hardened by the streets which greet him with prejudice and suspicion, he must be the passionate lover, the man who would die for his beloved, the man pierced by Cupid's arrow. Different from his more masculine counterparts who embody the puritanical work ethic and are inherently guided by logic and reason, the Italian-American man falls victim to the impulses of his libido, to the power of love, and to the beauty of women. Passion is that which governs his behavior, and due to this, he becomes less of a man in comparison with the strength and emotional repression of Anglo-Saxon counterparts. This mediatic representation of the Latin lover, which Bondanella presents us, quote, projects an image of seductive charm, sexual prowess, and physical action, or at least the hint of it. He was not the rugged, all-American boy type who would kiss the horse rather than the girl, wore exquisite costumes beautifully, moved with the grace of a ballet dancer, and performed action sequences like a trained athlete. He represented romance full of passionate embraces, elegant manners, and danger, an escape from the everyday. Quote. This trope, too, appears in the virgin suicides amongst the neighborhood boys. The person in whom it is incarnate is Dominic Palazzolo, a first-generation Italian immigrant to the suburb who arrived the same year the Lisbon girls took their lives. The way he fashions himself is immediately thrust upon us, and he comes across as palpably foreign. He is fundamentally different from the mainline boys, and even, too, in many ways, from his Italian-American and assimilated counterpart, Paul Baldino. Paul is second generation at least, whereas Dominic is fresh off the boat. Our first encounter with Dominic Palazzolo reads as such, quote, Dominic was the immigrant kid, staying with relatives until his family got settled in New Mexico. He was the first boy in our neighborhood to wear sunglasses, and within a week of arriving, he had fallen in love. The object of his desire wasn't Cecilia, but Diana Porter. Dominic Pellozzolo didn't join in our conversations, but every now and then he would tilt his head back so that his sunglasses reflected the sky and would say, "I love her," end quote. In communion with Bondanella's articulation of the Latin lover, Dominic Pellozzolo is controlled by romantic impulse and concerns himself with fashion in a manner which the other neighborhood boys do not do. While the other boys approach the prospect of love from a distance, love for Dominic is at the vanguard of his lived experience. Love to Dominic is so formative that, when confronted with rejection by Diana Porter, he is incentivized to harm himself in the name of love. Eugenides writes, quote, "At the beginning of June, when Diana Porter left on vacation to Switzerland, Dominic was stricken. 'Fuck the Holy Mother,' he said, despondent. 'Fuck God.' And to show his desperation and the validity of his love, he climbed onto the roof of his relative's house and jumped off. We watched him. We watched Cecilia Lisbon watching from her front yard. Dominic Pellozzolo, with his tight pants, his dingo boots, his pompadour, he towed to the roof's edge like a high diver and whispered, 'I love her,' to himself as he dropped past the windows and into the yard's calculated shrubbery. He didn't hurt himself. He stood up after the fall, having proved his love." End quote. He embodies the Italian-American Latin lover's propensity towards danger, towards love. In doing so, he also prefigures the death by falling of Cecilia Lisbon, who herself watches Dominic's stunt. His stunt is in dialogue with the suicides of the Lisbon sisters, and he is therefore likened in a certain sense to them, to their femininity. The foreignness of the Italian man we see in Dominic for the other neighborhood boys recalls femininity, as a real American boy doesn't act this way. If the Italian-American doesn't evoke criminality as does Paul Baldino, he is emasculate, a castrato which underscores the absence of the American presentation par excellence of his approach to masculinity. I'll cut myself off there as I'm at time, but thank you.
Yeah, you're good. You're good. Okay.
Next is the registration. La prossima è quella registrata.
It's recorded from our colleague Marco.
PhD student in American Studies at the University of Texas in Austin. I'm also a musician and arts administrator in the nonprofit sector. As a student in American Studies, I research immigration and diaspora culture, music history, Latin American politics, and imperialism. My work is currently concentrated on the intersections, cultural productions, and conflict between the African and Italian diasporas across the Americas, Europe, and Africa. My work thus far is by no means a definitive overview of this enormous topic, which spans centuries and continents. I am actively researching and looking for new connections that resonate with my drive to highlight what I tentatively call transnational intersectional diasporas. My inspiration for choosing this academic direction is born out of my own transnational, multiracial, diasporic experience, mainly between Uruguay and New Jersey and New York. My intimate connection between two locations of the Italian diaspora and my identity as an Italo-Latino in the United States informs my comparative perspective. I am intrigued by the formation of diaspora, cultural memory, and its performative measures, as well as the diversity between diasporas, and furthermore, how different dynamics arise when two diasporas are interhelixed with each other in different locations. I look at how political economies, racial formations, and interactions with other ethnicities can yield different cultural results within different locations of a diasporic web, which can be revealed in cultural productions and analyzed comparatively. As I think about the specific connections between the Italian and African diasporas and their interactions in different locations, these diasporic interactions have produced some of the most influential cultural productions in locations across the Americas, from New York and New Orleans to Havana and Buenos Aires and beyond. As I conduct my research, I realize that the breadth of this cultural collaboration and conflict between the Italian and African diasporas is even farther reaching than anticipated, both temporally and geographically. It is without question that this conversation must be extended to include Italy's colonial projects in East Africa, the fairly recent waves of African migration in Italy, and Italy's geographic proximity to Africa, as well as Italy's risorgimento in North and South divide, and the idea of Italy as a country that produced mass migration throughout the entire world. In this context, Italy's potential to vacillate in perspective between being Southern Europe and Northern Africa, culturally speaking, comes into full view. There is a growing scholarship in Italian diaspora studies, as well as African diaspora studies, and work that concentrates on the nuance of identities within the Americas from a Latino studies perspective. There is also scholarship that redirects the conversation about race and ethnicity to center a Latin American perspective, working to expand and distinguish itself from the North American racial project. Furthermore, with the substantial amount of recent immigration from Latin America and Africa to Europe, as well as the immigration from Africa to the Americas, the cosmopolitan experience from below, as Paul Gilroy notes, in Europe, Africa, and the Americas has transformed into subjective musical chairs within particular national backdrops that provide historical foundations unique to these locations. With this vantage point in mind, my work attempts to add to the legacy of this work that untangles the notion of fixed identities, explores identity formation, and imbues transnational culture in hopes of de-essentializing identities from their imagined national and racial origins, while also celebrating these representations of culture as truly post-colonial frameworks of culture making. For this conference, I would like to talk about musician Luca Prodan. As an Italian born with Italian and Scottish parents, educated in Italy and Scotland, with stints of life in Italy, Scotland, England, and Argentina, he embodies the kind of subject I am drawn to, that is, a subject that lives within the parameters of a transnational, intersectional diaspora. As the founder and lead singer of Argentine band Sumo, Luca Prodan was able to translate his musicality from Thatcher-era, London-centric punk expressions into post-Dirty War Argentine awakening. Through this translation, Luca becomes a vessel of musical and cultural influences, of which he is then able to superimpose onto a new geography. As an active member of the late 1970s London punk scene, he is able to use the language of punk, and more acutely of reggae, as what Petra R. River-Rideu calls, in her book, Remixing Reggaeton, a diasporic resource. This diasporic resource is multidimensional. On one hand, it could be argued that Prodan's proposal to interject himself into the paradigm of a fairly conservative moment in Argentine cultural production via a punk expression was well received precisely because of his Italian identity. As one of the most substantial nodes of the Italian diaspora, and with its own set of xenophobic and racist discourse, I argue that Argentina's warm reception of punk and reggae, in particular, was aided by Prodan's Italianità. This argument is constructed in light of the politics that drove Argentina to become a node in the Italian diaspora, its projects of racialization and its erasure of a multiracial national imaginary, the growing prominence of reggae worldwide versus its consumption in Argentina, and the ubiquitousness of reggae in post-sumo Argentine popular culture. I would also argue that Prodan's cosmopolitan access to reggae, via his membership in London punk culture, allows him to appropriate reggae as a white man, much like The Clash and other first-wave punk bands of the late 1970s. The performative presentation of an Italian man singing reggae in English in Buenos Aires in the mid-1980s challenged the Argentine status quo, much like it challenged the English status quo almost 10 years earlier. However, the added element of Prodan's Italianità turned Prodan into a cultural liaison, allowing Black cultural production to be vesseled through him as both an African and Italian diasporic resource, and being received from what Argentines might have thought was their own cultural and racial kin in Luca Prodan. The idea of Prodan becoming a vessel for an African diasporic resource came into fruition in the 1990s and early 2000s during the birth of cumbia villera, a musical genre that was racialized as Black in Argentina. In Argentina's racial discourse, Black had become synonymous with poor, and so at the height of neoliberal mechanisms pushing Andean migrant workers against Argentina's middle class, cumbia villera's roots in the humble slums of Buenos Aires were able to draw on the cultural memory of sumo's punk irreverence, if indirectly, to induct themselves within the pantheon of Black diasporic cultural production. My ultimate point here is that sumo primed the public 15 years prior, laying down the foundation for a possibility that Black cultural production was even possible in Argentina, even without actually being Black, and notwithstanding the fact that Argentina's memory of tango's history had already totally eliminated the crucial Black presence in the creation of tango. Sumo did not hide behind their disdains through metaphors. They did away with the washed-up, downtrodden energy of Argentine rock nacional and brought post-punk flavored with reggae and served it on a platter of self-aware irony, showing no mercy to the political and social climates in stuffy mid-1980s Buenos Aires. There is no doubt that sumo's presence in the underground music scene in 1980s Buenos Aires was what many felt to be a reconfiguration of what Argentine rock music could sound like. Sumo is popularly recognized as the first band to play reggae in Argentina as an Argentine band. In their 5-year span, they released 3 studio albums, and each of these releases displays distinct flavors of sumo's palette, from the funk vamp of La Rubia Tarada, which encapsulates the vapid and tiring culture of upper-middle-class Argentine youth, to Viejos Vinagres, which expresses a sense of claustrophobia in Argentina's old energy, much in the spirit of Bob Dylan's The Times They Are Changing. These songs were effective in pulling in the Argentine audience as relatively easy-to-consume songs that might have felt familiar, musically speaking. Where sumo made their mark, however, is in the variety of their repertoire, showing their versatility through soft, introspective, balladesque songs like Heroin, which were clearly an homage to the Velvet Underground's landmark hit of the same name, to the Sex Pistols-inspired Quran Chan off their last album, which punkifies the famous fee, fi, fo, fum battle cry of the Culloden Battle of 1746 between Scotland and England, complete with an overdriven guitar emulating droning bagpipes. Beyond Sumo's ability to introduce punk aesthetics to a musical landscape tamed by political suppression, it was their ability to introduce a black musical paradigm, like reggae, into a country both socialized by the marketing of Argentina's whiteness, as well as their ability to cut through their paranoia to stay within the limits of a conservatism and austerity brought about by the presence of the military junta. On the contrary, Sumo exposed these limits and explicitly stepped over them, which supposes the idea that, in the case of this political climate, the Argentine youth had reached their boiling point, and Luca cracked the door open for them. Luca's heritage afforded a mutual familiarity between him and the Argentine public, steeped in Italianisms, brought to them via the prior waves of immigration in the early 20th century, which seemed to place Luca in a culturally liminal space between native and foreigner status. This duality of distance versus intimacy offered Luca a special podium of which he can both deploy his foreign ideas and have them received with a trust built on kinship, based on Italianità. Paradoxically, his foreign ideas, steeped in multicultural and multiracial post-colonial interactions, were also accepted because of a manifest Eurocentricity that enveloped Argentina's self-proclaimed whiteness, despite its realistic fallacy. However, the reason why an Afrocentric genre like reggae worked in the context of an Argentine reality is not through racial struggle, but through class struggle. Nonetheless, Argentina's ties with reggae furthered the conversations of blackness, oppression, and an awareness of Argentina's placement in the global South. After Prodan's untimely death in 1987, Argentina's popular musical output co-opted many of the motifs presented to them, both in music and in ethos, by Sumo, namely in bands like Los Fabulosos Cadillacs, Los Pericos, and Todos Tus Muertos. In the 1990s, we saw bands like Mano Negra, albeit European-based, but with the same transnational, intersectional, diasporic approach. The 2000s brought forth Cumbia Villera in Argentina, with its own circumstance of a transnational, intersectional, diasporic approach, combined with a heavy dose of what can be described as a misnomered racialization of indigenous and mestizo populations from Argentina's Andean region and other Andean countries, who were coined to have a black identity, first derogatorily imposed upon them by white Argentines, and later to be self-championed in slogans like 100% black. Although it would help my argument to expand upon these expressions, in the pursuit of brevity, I can now only point to these productions as expressions that rely on Sumo and Luca Prodan as a foundation. Prodan's story is a story of musical and cultural migration that has sowed the seeds that continue to nourish diasporic cultural production. Thank you.
Usiamo un altro. Eccoci. Sì, mi sentite? Va bene. Allora, intanto I wanted to thank the organizer of the conference, and also I'm very happy to be here with people I met in the Italian diaspora summer studies. Both Marco and Sam have been with me in these studies, and I see fellow summer studies in the audience as well. So I'm very happy to be in their company, and also I feel very happy to be in a city that represents diasporas, but also has become a second home for me. So I consider very fortunate to be able to present here in Genova. So I'm Elisabetta Sanino D'Amanda. I am the coordinator of the Italian program at the Rochester Institute of Technology, Rochester, New York. And my research focuses on Italian cinema and more recently on Italian-American cinema. I'm also a documentary filmmaker. And in both realms, I'm interested in the intersectionality of, I wrote it so I say it right, intersectionality of the minoritized communities being by gender, racially, sexually, for age and abilities. I got interested in this film because I came across an Instagram post of Jennifer Esposito, and later on I will elaborate why that triggered my first interest, so I'm not going to tell you now. Wait until the end. And then secondly, I was interested because while in the 1990s Italy there was a strong development of film on donne di mafia, mafia women films were very prolific 1990s forward. Then now we're kind of in a stop, but relatively early compared to United States, where this topic of women of mafia had not been touched by filmmakers, interestingly being such a foundational cinema for mafias. So for me it was totally surprising, and when I came across this film I said, well, I'm interested to talk about this. I'm interested to look into this and now talk about it. So Fresh Kills is a mafia drama that most played out the most played out of all genres, particularly for independent films. It was written and directed by an actor known mostly from cop TV series. Jennifer Esposito debut feature marks a change from her known acting roles. We have seen her in Blue Bloods, NCIS, among other TV series, to screenwriting and directing. Now it's me fighting with this. Esposito doubled down, however, as you can see in the slide with her present. Doubled down, however, is she's also acting in the role of Francine, the mother of two different sisters navigating their unusual living condition from the late 1980s through the mid-1990s. Their environment is the rather dramatically named neighborhood Fresh Kills. Kill in Dutch means stream, and obviously New Amsterdam would have names that pertain to the old names of being Dutch, in Staten Island, which results also in obvious film title play on words, Fresh Kills. Thanks to The Sopranos, everyone knows about North Jersey Italian-American culture, both more hardcore, even more than Nassau, Suffolk County lines in Long Island, is the New York City seldom discussed fifth borough, Staten Island. In this liminal space of urban and suburban living that for decades has bred Staten Island's largest claim to fame, the Fresh Kill landfill where the garbage of the most important city in the world was sent to rot until 2001. So I put here this in the slide not only to point out where Staten Island is, but hopefully you do know, but in this slide the detail is from where Jennifer Esposito went to school, in the high school that I have here written, Moore Catholic High School, all the way to where the ex now Fresh Kills was located. So just to tell how this is a story that is really connected to Jennifer Esposito, because she actually lived in that neighborhood and she was in a very close distance as she was growing up to this location that she discusses. Back to my writing. So when the stench of the film Fresh Kills makes his first appearance just a few minutes into Esposito's film, we know that we are in safe hands. Esposito has said that she has wanted to make this film for 16 years, and it is evident that personal truth is contained in every frame. She knows it because she lived it, and everything about the film, from the hairstyles to the sofas to the music coming out of the cars, such as the 1984 Lookout Weekend by Debbie Deb, is on point. So, on a surface level, one might say the film is simply a recontextualized mob story rooted in the female perspective. However, this is a reductive read because at its core, what Fresh Kill is about is how toxic parents can wound their children deeply, and how families choose to uphold the system of abuse and not break their cycles. The best movies about mafia, about the mob, are rarely only about the mob. They use the mob to smuggle in ideas about America, toxic masculinity, and capitalism. Most of the time, not always, but a lot of the time, they center on men. Jennifer Esposito's writing and directorial debut, Fresh Kills, is a movie that explored the mob from the perspective of a rage embedded in its womanhood, a rage born of being trapped and pushed to the sidelines. Much like Scorsese's Goodfellas, there is an undercurrent boiling anger that threatens to erupt at any moment. And like so many sibling relationship, Rose, Emily Bender, and Kani's Odessa Zion relationship changes shape over the years when we meet them for the first time as young girl in 1987, and we see that Rose and Kani are playing a variation of Dad's playing game, with Connie's holding Rose aloft, while Rose stretches her arms in the playing shape. The trust between their sisters is freely given, but the trust held by their fathers, interpreted by Dominic Lambordozzi, is demanded. The Fresh Kills Kani character is also a clear citation of the Godfather's Kani, with a role of the boss daughter. However, Fresh Kills Kani does not just fight off the toxic masculinity to succumb to it as the Godfather one, as she does take on the toxic masculinity all around, not complying to the traditional female role, while still, however, internalizing the oppressor in her competitiveness with the other women and lacking solidarity in search of the father's approval. Immediately after, it comes a moment when the young girls are hiding in their father's car in the garage, planning on surprising him, and wide-eyed, they hear and see him conducting mob business and see a pistol tucked in his waistband. This scene is less about the mob, but more about the moment of clarity when a child first realizes who their parents are. A lot of Fresh Kills is about an unspoken agreement between parents and children to carry on after kids are burdened with this knowledge. For Rose, this becomes too much, however, and despite living in the greater New York metro area of Staten Island, her world feels unbearably small. Women are expected to marry within the small coterie of age-appropriate men within the crime family, and then swallow any dreams they might have had in the past. Their job is to maintain the sheen of an unwounded home despite the day-to-day cost of the men's participation in crime. An early scene as young Rose and Connie peering from the top of the stair down at the argument between mother and father, during a rare moment where their mother, Francine, breaks ranks. Their father looks up and tells the girl to go back to sleep. Go back to sleep, girls. Everything is fine. And the mother replies, no, everything is not fine. This moment calls to mind something throughout the film. The camera movement is understated and never calls attention to itself. When the camera does move, it is slow pushes, pulls, and dollies. It is a camera that is as nervous as the uncomfortable... sorry, I lost my... is nervous and uncomfortable around this family as it is Rose. Peppered throughout the film, an intriguing subversion of the Sopranos' recurring motif of Tony watching television is also present. Mob-themed media is frequently in conversation with its genre contemporaries, as they often are dealing with themes related to family, the second and third generation immigrant family experience, control systems, and the fallacy of the American dream. In The Sopranos, Tony is frequently depicted first in the living room and then in the pool house watching television. It's never a new film or television that Tony is watching, it's always classical cinema. His escape is nostalgia. Nostalgia as escape is a primary theme of Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas. In Fresh Kills, Rose is often seen watching daytime talk shows. Her escape is the Tory spectacle of Phil Donahue and Sally Jesse Raphael. It's difficult to overstate the cultural prominence of the daytime talk show in the 1980s, 1990s United States. But, you know, this kind of subtext for the audience, at least my problem aren't as bad as those poor bastards on Donahue. It's kind of the what the audience of this type of show would experience. Each one of these hosts had a different way of communicating their superiority and a separation from the topics they covered. So naturally, Rose finds escapism in these shows. She wants to be separate from spectacle and able to sit in judgment in it. She dreams of going to Manhattan and becoming a daytime host, getting away from her father and the family that protects him. The declination of toxic masculinity takes on more or less canonical shades in this contemporary day mafia film. Rose's childhood sweetheart, Bobby Jr., David Iacono, interpreting, proposes to her during a wedding compliant to the family code, but bypassing her real desires, as she has told him she does not want to be engaged yet. Stunned, Rose mutually accepts only to break it off later. I want to be more than a wife, she tells her mother, a statement that infuriates and hurts Francine. Not because she does not understand, but because once she thought the same thing. Another variation of the toxic masculinity is the cousin Ali, Nicolas Cirillo, who embodies the more traditional patriarchal mob Next Generation, chosen as the heir by the two sisters' father, Joe, being the only blood male relative. And he asserts his entitled position in the bakery business that the Joe has acquired as a cover, where the daughters and the nephew are working. Fresh Kills explores the way men destroy women by merely not even considering them. Rose's father uproots his family and moves them to Staten Island. He lies about the reason, and it is not until Francine realizes that his co-workers live nearby that she begin to suspect his real motivation. Director Esposito could care less about the mob. They are set dressing for a multi-generational look of women lashing out at each other because of the choices they were forced to make. Esposito makes the violence in the film sudden and quick. The real feeling of dangers is when Rose is forced to choose between herself and her family. Rose is a quiet, observant girl, unlike the older sister, Connie, who never lets a thought go unuttered or a feeling unexpressed. Rose's wishes, she had Connie's confidence, the self-possession that allows her to dominate every room she walks into. But Connie wishes she had Rose's smarts and courage to stand up to what she sees. But none of this is said. It is shown in the way their eyes blaze and observe each other. Esposito parallels the relationship of Rose and Connie with their mother Francine and her sister Annabella Sciorra. The two mirror Rose and Connie, the disparate personalities, as well as how one witness events, Christine, and the other, Francine, is an active participant. The American dream is a lie, that much Francine knows as an Italian. She tells her kids, our families came here with nothing. You're led to believe things are fair here. They are not. She uses the generational divide filled with sadness and unfulfilled dreams to speak of a different kind of dream deferred. Christine tells Rose, you get to a certain point in your life and you gotta accept that things aren't really going to work out the way you dreamed they were. Christine can barely get her word out because uttering them is admitting the gaping sadness in her being. That sadness and anger pulsates under every scene of Fresh Kills. It is not just about women mobster or even something as banal as wish fulfillment, but being at the very real precipice of what it means to have freedom of choice. There is nothing wrong with wanting the freedom of choice that your daughters get. Francine sees how it can morph into fighting to keep them close, so you're not reminded of what you gave up. Francine and Christine look at Rose and Connie and they're jealous, proud, and confused. Christine and Francine deftly portray two sisters who have a lifetime of baggage they have overcome. Though it is nothing compared to a secret about the death of Christine's husband and Joe's involvement, the husband of Francine, that threatens to destroy their fragile yet indestructible bond. The two shares a scene that is rife with unexpressed anger and grief, that is all the more potent because they try to push it aside. Francine looks so alone as she sits with her daughter and as her sister leaves the room in tears. Christine is devastated, but cannot bear to express it because it would hurt the family. Christine and Francine are the generation that cannot overcome the patriarchal trappings. Fresh Kills would make a fascinating double feature with Martin Scorsese's breakthrough feature Mean Streets, which is also about a small group of mob-entangled young people grappling with whether to give into a code, social condition, and predetermined life path ended them at birth, or rebel and be ostracized or beaten or murdered and disappear. Esposito is taking a cue also from Robert Altman's. She has stories unfolding around the edges of the film, such as Rose's pregnancy, which, while important, is never the center of the story, nor it is the abortion discussion. in book-ending format, the film opens and closes with the same car scenes. The red car the father donated to Kanye, the red car forever cinema's avatar for unattainable dreams, driven by Rose, who reminisces about their troubled childhood. But by the end, Rose has found the key to the change, challenging this toxic patriarchy and manifesting her distrust to her father and all that he represents openly, including driving that very same car to the edge of the water, but stopping just in time not to put forth a suicide. I don't want to spoil your vision in case you haven't seen the film, so I'm not going to say why the suicide wish. So go watch the film. That's my wish. In fact, the Esposito resolution speaks to Adrienne's rich idea of revision. In Rich's word, revision as the act of looking back, of seeing with fresh eyes, of entering an old text from a critical direction, is for women an act of survival in order to uncover hidden meanings and challenge established power dynamics. Essentially, it is about actively reinterpreting the past to gain a deeper understanding of the present and empower change. End of quote of Adrienne Rich. Fresh Kills is Jennifer Esposito revision of the Mafia narrative through this group of women. She's actively looking back as she engages with the drama through the perspective of Rose, uncovering the truth, positing through a revision of her stance, the change. Or as Audre Lorde would have said, one of her most famous quotes, for the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow you to temporarily beat him to his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. So now, for the critical reception and to the post on Instagram I was talking to you about before, Jennifer Esposito was thanking the journalist, what is his name? Right now I don't remember. Brian Cartwright, I put it there for a reason. And thank you. She was thanking him in this Instagram post, and she was saying, the media reaction to Fresh Kills has sadly hovered between disinterest and misogyny. The film has no meaningful marketing budget from distributor quiver. The director Esposito's offered to garner attention for the film have met with frustrating result. One talk show appearance to promote the film was met with Esposito mainly fielding questions about her personal life until the waning seconds of this segment. The replies to her ex-post peppered the directors with question about why actor Dominic Lombardozzi is not more prominent in the marketing. So it's obvious that this film that is so groundbreaking, being really a first film on mafia and women of mafia being central and front and central, not just side people that are seen within the story of mafia, has been completely gone under the radar. And so I'm not giving you the information about the suicide attempt so that you go, please, on Prime and watch this film and disseminate the word because this is important stuff. This is my opinion. I hope you follow my advice. has no money. Sorry, this distributor has no money to send the person out and connect with journalists for publicity. Consider that Jennifer Esposito mortgaged her own home to make this film. So she has really put in what we say in filmmaking, blood and tears and all the rest. And then she has this type of return on a film that is really watchable. It's not at all a bad film. I could understand if the film was bad, that, you know, would go under the radar, but the film is not bad. It's absolutely an important film to watch. So, yeah, it's very strange. And also, she doubles down being a director, screenwriter, and actor in the film. So difficult to do. Many much bigger names have failed, you know, to the attempt of doing this type of thing. So there is also now not acknowledgement of someone that is relatively a pop, you know, star, you know, in the NCIS, Blue Blood. But then when she turns the camera on herself, no one wants to, I don't know what's wrong with the world. There's a question over there.
I will see the film, so I don't see the film, and I don't understand in which because the subject that you evoked was I don't think that Carmela Soprano was a secondary. I can see in the Soprano the point of view of Carmela and all the stuff of the daughter Mito that realized who is his parent and his family. So I love Soprano because I think that it's very present, the family and the woman position in the toxic masculinity of the families. So I'm very curious to see in which this film offers to us a very point of view of the woman.
We're talking TV series versus film, and while there is a dialogue in between genders, genre, sorry, not genders, but genre, the issue is that Soprano had the luxury to evolve through time, has the luxury to feel the street and respond to the street in the script writing, right? Which is great, and I agree with you. Carmela's character and the daughters are very, very important, right? So I'm not saying that that doesn't exist. I've never seen, though, a film that is on Mafia that is women-centered piece. That's what I never seen in the US production. That I was trying to say, not that it doesn't exist at all. Even Connie is in Godfather, is a very powerful character, is in the 70s mode, kind of trying to break the mold in that discussion of that period of writing. But, you know, they're always not the center of the story. They're a response to the story, even though there is some already discussion on genre, even in Godfather. But even Soprano, it is at the end a male story, right? Where the women takes more relevance as the crisis of masculinity ensue, right? Even the therapist is very important, right? Because it's obviously there is that dialogue, but she's not part of the system, she's outside the system. So, yeah, I don't know. That's my...
I'm very curious. Thank you for this.
That's what I wanted. Again, I garner one. Okay.
You're not considering comedy at all.
No, I was just considering. Right. I was considered just the genre as the classical, the cult of mafia type of scenario. Yeah, but you're right about that.
Two things. One is a comment and one is a question. Well, they're kind of both comments. The first is on Carmela, actually, in the tie with this. I read a lot online of reactions to The Sopranos because I came late to watching it. And Well, the acting is highly acclaimed. In the general Italian-American population, there's a real hatred of Carmela. So many of the comments are extremely misogynistic when we look at that character. So I think it's not really that big of a difference other than the backing and the as you're saying, the male structure of the Sopranos is what allows that Carmela character to live in there, and then she's often hated by people as well. And then the other thing I wanted to say was I do teach women's literature, and because of your talk, I'm planning on incorporating this film and having my students discuss not just the film itself, but what has happened or not happened to it because of the primacy of femininity in the film and in the creation of the film itself. So I really want to thank you for drawing my attention to it.
Thank you for doing that. I already won. Okay, I think we're good. I think we're good. We can talk after.
Very interesting. I want to see another time.
Yes, me too.
Because
Me
I
too.
don't remember anything.